Mr O'Connor.
Good morning, my lady. Lady, just before we call our first witness, my transcript screen is blank, and I imagine yours is too. We understand that there is a technical problem with the computer system, which in fact is a widespread problem going far beyond the bounds of this inquiry. It's affecting transcription services across at least London, as we gather. The position is that the transcriber is present. She will be making a transcript of this morning's proceedings. We won't, sadly, be able to see it on our screens as long as the problem lasts. And, of course, steps are being taken to remedy it, and I understand that as soon as the problem has been resolved, our screens will click into action and we'll be able to get the usual contemporaneous transcript.
Thank you, Mr O'Connor.
Lady, may we please call our first witness, Mr Khan?
Might you repeat after me? I swear by Allah.
I swear by Allah.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Could you give us your full name, please?
My name is Sadiq Khan.
Mr Khan, you have kindly prepared a witness statement for the inquiry, which is coming on the screen now. It's a lengthy statement, and we're grateful for it. The last page we don't need to look at, but it was signed by you on the 16th of June of this year, and immediately above your signature, there's a statement that you believe the facts stated in the witness statement to be true. Is that right?
Correct, yeah, thank you.
Mr Khan, you are currently, of course, the Mayor of London. Casting our eyes back over your career, it's right, I think, that you were a Labour MP, in fact the MP for Tooting, between 2005 and 2016.
Yeah, that's right.
And within that period, you undertook various ministerial government roles between 2008 and 2010?
Between 2007 and 2010, yeah.
2007, thank you. And then after the 2010 election, you had various shadow ministerial roles in opposition until you left Parliament in 2016, and that was the year on which you were first elected the Mayor of London, and you're currently serving your second term in that post.
That's right, yeah.
It's obvious from that chronology that you were the Mayor of London throughout the period of the pandemic, 2020, 2022.
That's right.
And that is, of course, going to be the focus of our questions this morning. Before we move to the events of the pandemic, Mr Khan, I'd like to ask you just a few questions about the role of the Mayor of London, the powers, what the job entails, and so on. And of course, the Mayor of London is the senior elected politician with territorial responsibility for London. And on our ready reckoner, we think that there are something like 9 million people within the area for which you have responsibility. Is that right?
That's right. So in London, there are more than 9 million people who live, and during a normal working day, more than 10 million come to London. Workers, tourists, visitors, and so forth.
Yeah. And using another ratio, that 9 million people equates to something like 13% of the UK population.
That's right.
Let's look at your statement, please, at paragraph 14, which is on page 3. It's here that you give us a detailed explanation of the role and powers of the Mayor. And we're not going to go into all of that detail, but let's just try and summarise the position. As you state here, the powers of the Mayor, in fact the mayoralty itself, is established, is it not, by the Greater London Authority Act of 1999?
That's right.
And the Greater London, or the Act, creates and then describes the powers of this institution called the Greater London Authority, which itself is formed of the Mayor and the Assembly. Is that a fair summary?
It is, yeah.
The Mayor has, as we will see in a moment, some strategic powers as well as other duties, and the principal role of the Assembly is to hold the Mayor to account.
Correct.
If we look at paragraph 15, and then we'll go over the page in a moment to paragraph 16, we see that, that the power under section 30 of the Act allows the Mayor, in the words of your statement, to do anything which furthers one of its so-called principal purposes, which are then described as promoting economic development, wealth creation, social development, or the improvement of the environment in Greater London. So high-level powers, high-level purposes. And then as you go on to make the point under section 31, that the Act under that section expressly prevents the authority, the Mayor, from providing any health or social services which could be provided by a London Borough Council or any other public body. And just going on to paragraph 16, you make the point that the authority is therefore limited to carrying out the functions expressly conferred on it, and that it is a strategic authority, quite different from, for example, the local authorities in London who have responsibility for the delivery of services. So is it then, Mr. Khan, a fair summary that the role of the Mayor is to perform these sort of high-level strategic functions rather than sort of operational decisions which are the preserve in London of borough councils and other bodies?
It is, but it brings with it huge convening powers. So I do work very closely with those authorities you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, and we'll come to see in terms of your the sort of role of the Mayor in an emergency that's a rather good description. It's about convening other people more than actually performing executive functions yourself.
Exactly.
And if we just think about the pandemic and about the NPIs that were adopted during the pandemic, we think, for example, of ordering people to stay at home, closing schools, closing hospitality venues, and so on. These were not executive decisions for you to take during that time, were they?
They weren't. There's a separate piece of legislation which we'll come to, I'm sure, the Civil Contingencies Act, which states basically that Mayor GLA is the voice of London. So in civil emergencies, he or she has an important role in being that voice, particularly when it comes to message carrying.
Yes.
For Londoners to know what to do. Just
to be clear, I'm certainly going to come to the Civil Contingencies Act and that sort of facilitative role, and you're absolutely right in your statement. You used that term, being the voice of London. But just to be clear, it's right, isn't it, that it wasn't actually your role to make those executive decisions, closing schools.
Correct.
Ordering people to stay at home and the like.
Correct.
So, as you say, with that in mind, the Mayor does have responsibilities in an emergency as what's known as a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. That's the point you make if we look at paragraph 19 of your statement on page 4.
That's right, yeah.
And again, your statement then goes on to provide us with some very useful detail about all of the different bodies that were established in order to perform your role and the role of the authority more generally in that civil contingencies context.
That's right.
And again, I'm not going to go into all of that in as much detail as there is in the statement, but shall we try and identify the critical parts of it? And if we go on to paragraph 20, we see there you refer to the GLA being a member of something called the London Resilience Forum. And reading on in that paragraph, this London Resilience Forum you describe as being the vehicle required by statute to facilitate the cooperation of statutory responders in London. So it's the high-level body performing that sort of bringing together facilitative role.
Spot on, spot on.
And you say in the next sentence that Fiona Twycross chaired the London Resilience Forum on your behalf. I think it's right, isn't it, that you have a sort of a power or duty either to chair that forum yourself or to nominate someone to do that. Is that the position?
That's right. So Fiona Twycross, Baroness Twycross, is the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, and I asked her in June 2016, a month after I became Mayor, to chair the London Resilience forum, because obviously they have work to do, not just at times of civil emergency, but other times as well.
Yes, so as we'll see, some of these committees and groups that were operational during the pandemic had existed previously.
Exactly.
Sometimes known as in peacetime. Others were brought into being to perform a specific role during the pandemic.
That's right.
And the London Resilience Forum was one of those that is always sitting. It's always considering matters. And so, what did you consider sort of taking over the chairmanship of the London Resilience Forum during the pandemic, or not?
There were meetings I did chair, but as far as the LRF is concerned, we appointed a number of co-chairs to work with Fiona. John Barrell and Eleanor, the chief executive from Southwark, performed different roles. I should explain there is different furniture to do with different pieces of work. So there's a strategic coordination committee, there's a London Resilient Protocol partnership, and so a number of different fora. I chaired some of them. For continuity, Fiona, John Barrell, and others chaired others.
Yes. So you weren't you didn't become the chair of the London Resilience Forum, but you worked very closely with it. And as you've said, there were a number of other organisations, groups running alongside it. If we can go down to the next paragraph, please, paragraph 20. No, sorry, in fact, 20. If we look at paragraph 22, there's a reference there to another of these groups, which I think you mentioned a moment ago, the Strategic Coordination Group. Is this one of those groups that didn't exist, or at least wasn't sort of up and running during so-called peacetime, but which became operational during the pandemic?
That's right. So in early March, on the 2nd of March, I chaired a Mayor's Advisory Group, and we decided to do a number of things flowing from our concerns from the media about the pandemic arriving, and the SCG is one of the things that we set up.
So that's the Strategic Coordination Group, and we see in paragraph 22 the description of its role is really the implementation of plans. Would that be including the implementation of plans designed by the Resilience Forum?
Exactly.
So it's the sort of the operational arm of that organisation.
And in this case, specifically to do with coronavirus rather than other issues that the fora has to deal with.
And last point on this, we can see in this paragraph that the Strategic Coordination Group measures its work alongside something called the Strategic Coordination Protocol. Again, was that a COVID-specific document, or was that a protocol which had been designed before the pandemic?
So the protocol was designed before the statutory guidance in relation to the role of the GLA and Pan-London governance, but the SCG was set up because of the coronavirus, using the protocol as a basis of who should be on this and so forth.
Yeah. So we're getting a picture of this sort of network hierarchy of organisations, some of which were there all along, some of which were brought into being for the sake of the pandemic. You are very much involved, one way or another, in this system. And if we can look at paragraph 25, please, which is over the page on page 6. This is, I think, a summary of this description. And picking it up 4 lines down, you say, and this is where we come back to your point about the voice, you say, my role is to support the operational response to an emergency in London by providing a unified statement of information and guidance, acting as a voice for London. Can you, with that in mind, expand on your role in all of this, this structure of various committees and forums?
So it's worth explaining that there are certain functional bodies I'm in charge of, the police, the fire service, the transport system. There are a number of others I'm not in charge of. But this multi-agency approach means that we can work together in a collegiate way. And that includes working with the councils. We've got 32 councils in London, plus the City of London Corporation, cross-party, working incredibly collegially. And I'm ostensibly the chair, working really closely with colleagues. It means we can pass on messages from the government, and I'm deemed to be, according to statutory guidance and government, generally speaking, the voice of London. But also, when we reach a decision, I can channel that up to the government as well. So it's a two-way process being the voice advocate for London, but also downwards from government down to London as well.
And we'll come to see, as we look at some of the documents and some of the notes of meetings and so on, that you were very much sort of advocating, if you like, lobbying government during the period of the pandemic for them to take action that you regarded as being in London's interests. Was that also part of this role?
Yes, so a lot of the information we had was from open source data, me just reading the newspapers, watching the news, and colleagues doing the same. And so we decided to set up, the SCG in advance of any information from the government. I was writing to the government. We were contacting the government to ask for information that wasn't coming January, February, or March, at the first half of March. But notwithstanding that's unusual, by the way. I can give examples of other emergencies where it hasn't happened. There's been cooperation. But in this case, we were doing this, getting the furniture set up, the architecture set up, because of the legislation, but also our experience from previous years. We knew this may be useful.
Yeah. Let me just ask you about your experience of other emergencies. I think it's obvious that this particular emergency was unlike anything that certainly anyone had come across before in their own career. But of course, you had been involved in other emergencies, both during your time as mayor and before that in government. As far as your time as the mayor is concerned, the Grenfell Tower disaster took place while you were mayor, and in the same year there were also the terrorist attacks at Westminster and London Bridge. We're going to come to talk about Cobra in the context of COVID, but it's right, isn't it, that you had experience of Cobra in those emergencies as well?
Look, there's nothing magic about Cobra. It's just the room where we meet. But Cobra is really important. Both when I was a minister, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, on a couple of occasions, Cobras were called, and I was invited to incredibly collegiate environment. When Theresa May was Prime Minister in 2017, a number of Cobras I was invited to do with the terrorist attacks in London, to do with Grenfell, and it's a really useful fora for colleagues to come together, politicians, experts in their own field, people from different parts of the country, to provide their expertise to discuss ideas. Then the chair, the Prime Minister, makes a decision. In fact, post the pandemic, when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, I again attended Cobras to do with Operation London Bridge. They're incredibly
just
useful.
Was there, London, that was the operation that followed the death of the Queen?
Yeah, the death of Her Late Majesty, yeah.
You were going to say?
Because a lot of these things require coordination and working together. At the very least, you can provide coalface experience. You can feed into the decision makers, the Prime Minister in particular, but also you're reading earlier about why things are happening. So as the voice of London, you can with confidence explain to Londoners what they should and shouldn't be doing. So Cobra in the past and since has worked incredibly well as this place to discuss various responses to prepare for civil emergencies.
Let's turn then, Mr. Khan, to 2020 and initially your sort of developing understanding of the pandemic. In your witness statement, I think you say that you, of course, initially gained an understanding in January, simply as with the rest of us, hearing about it on the news and so on. And it was the late January, the 23rd of January, you give a description of a question time event that you were conducting in London. And you actually, this was the first time you received a detailed briefing from your staff about COVID. Is that right?
It is, but I should just say my staff's knowledge of this was from open source data, from newspapers, from World Wide Web and so forth. It wasn't from a briefing from the government. But at People's Question Time, a member of the public had asked me about COVID, and my response was to that question asked by members of the public. And so my knowledge was limited, but it was being discussed clearly because it was raised at People's Question Time.
Yes. So that was your own personal sort of knowledge, and that was an occasion when you were briefed. The London Resilience Forum, which we've already mentioned, was right from the start analysing the ongoing position. Is that right?
Well, that's right. Again, the job of the London Resilience Forum is to prepare for any emergency. It could be worried about flash flooding. It could be about this. And so they, again, using open source data, had realised this may be an issue. And to their credit, in February, they'd started doing work to look into this virus.
Let's just go, if we may, to paragraph 59 of your witness statement, which is on page 14. And this picks up a point, Mr. Khan, you've been making. You say we, and I take it that you mean sort of corporately, you, your office, the Greater London Authority, were heavily reliant on the information coming from Paul Plant and PHE at this time. And again, I think at this time you mean sort of early February, judging by the sequence of events in your witness statement, as we were not receiving any information directly from government. First of all, can you tell us, please, who Paul Plant was at the time?
Sure. So one of the statutory duties of the Mayor is to address health inequalities. And I have a statutory health advisor, Professor Paul Plant, at the time, who works for Public Health England. It tends to be the regional director for London PHE, as it was known then, who advises me in relation to health inequalities. And Paul was a person who I'd meet regularly to discuss a variety of issues.
So just going back to this sentence, Paul Plant was himself, I think, one of the directors of the PHE.
Correct.
What's wrong with receiving information about a developing infectious virus from PHE, which was the very body that was supposed to monitor these things?
Oh, nothing wrong at all. I mean, in fact, I was asking Paul about this virus we'd heard of, and you'll see from, I think we've disclosed the agenda where this was discussed. This is one of a variety of issues that we discuss at PHE. The point is in relation to, directly from government, you've talked about the responsibility I have from the Civil Contingencies Act, the Greater London Act, and bear in mind what was to transpire. You'd have expected the government speaking to me, by government I mean extensively Downing Street, because we now know in February there were Cobra meetings taking place. We knew nothing about these, and probably Paul Plant didn't either, because it's above his pay grade. The point being is that we're the capital city. We know what happened. Had we been aware of some of the things that the government were concerned about in February or March, we could have taken preventative action.
So, to summarise, just to make sure we've understood, one of PHE's functions was to inform local authorities like you, and no doubt around the country, of their developing understanding of the virus. I think what you're saying is that there would have come a time where, judging by the sort of severity of the virus, the concerns about what may happen, you would have expected, in parallel to your exchanges with PHE, to have started being briefed by central government. You say Downing Street, but that, as we'll come to see, didn't happen at that time, or in fact for some time later.
Absolutely.
Are you saying that on the basis of any experience, or on the basis of hindsight, or simply a feeling you had at the time?
Well, without wishing to breach confidences, for example, we were in close contact with the government in advance of Operation London Bridge going live. I don't want it to be indelicate. But so there's often conversations with the government about things in advance of them becoming, us having to press go on issues. And so that sort of stuff does happen. It can be offline conversations. It can be direct communications with me in my office. We were chasing the government for information. I've shared correspondence with me writing to the government saying, look, we've heard about this thing happening. What do we do?
If I can just ask you to try and slow down a little when you're answering questions. Mr. Khan, were you chasing the government this early, in sort of early February? We'll come to see some of the exchanges a few weeks later, in late February and March. And perhaps you didn't realise how serious the position was becoming at this stage.
No, in February, I wasn't chasing the government. I wasn't aware how serious it was.
So to the extent you're criticising the government for not contacting you earlier, that's something, an observation you're making, perhaps with hindsight. Would that be fair?
The government generally does give us information about a variety of things happening. I'm disappointed the government won't give us information in February about what they knew then.
Knowing what you know now?
Knowing what we all know now, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course it depends on what they knew then.
Well, what I'd say, my lady, is that we were in contact at this stage in February and March, early March in particular, with other cities around the globe. So we've not got a foreign office in City Hall, but what we were doing is speaking to mayors. So I was speaking to the mayor of Milan. We were speaking to colleagues in Seoul, the mayor of Seoul, and colleagues in China from early March, in advance of any information from the government. Now, my international relations team is, I think, 3 people. I'd have hoped that the Foreign Office was speaking to colleagues in China or South Korea or Italy. We were in late February, early March.
Yeah, I think we've moved on to March. I think Mr O'Connor was at the moment dealing with February.
Yes, well, let's move on, Mr. Khan, because the paragraph we were looking at was, I think, located in early February. But let's move forward a few weeks to the period around the end of February and the beginning of March. As you say, there had been a number of Cobra meetings during February to which you hadn't been invited. We come then to Friday, the 28th of February, and a request we know was made on that day for you to attend a Cobra meeting that was due to take place at the beginning of the next week, on the 2nd of March, the Monday. And we can, for these purposes, just look at an email exchange. This is 118997. And we see here sort of about the lower half of this page, an email being sent from someone in your office whose name has been redacted to, I think it's Claire Brunton in number 10. It says this: the Mayor's Chief of Staff has asked whether number 10 intend to invite the Mayor to the Cobra meeting regarding coronavirus on Monday, that's the 2nd of March. Given its large number of airports, hospitals and international visitors, London is, of course, potentially one of the most at-risk places. And I'm going to come back to that, but just to finish off with this email, we can see that, in fact, on the same day, on the Friday, later on in the evening, the reply comes back, no, spoken to those leading, the Mayor will not be invited to the Cobra on Monday. But just going back to your email, please, the proposition is London is one of the places most at risk because of its airports, hospitals, international visitors and so on. That, of course, had been true since the beginning of the virus. Did sending this email on this day reflect some sort of developing understanding on your part or not?
It's the point I was making to Baroness Hallett. The conversation we were having, but also open source data showed this virus travels. We knew about what's happening in northern Italy. We also knew it's half term, and we also knew that London has a number of airports that serve our city: Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, City, the Eurostar, and so forth. So it wouldn't be a surprise if London was the first place this virus came to. So I was cognizant of all that in real time, without the benefit of hindsight. And just it appears to me, if we knew this in City Hall, and we've not got at our disposal the expertise Her Majesty's government has, why didn't they?
If we just move the chronology on a week, we'll see that something very similar happened a week later. If we could go, please, to 119008. If we look at the bottom of the page, there is an email dated the 8th of March, which is a Sunday, again from someone in your office to Claire Brunton, a request to attend Cobra, which was going to happen on the next day, the next Monday. Very similar request. Can the Mayor come to Cobra? Reason being the potential impact on London and Londoners. This time, if we we can see that the same response is received. If we can go up to the top of that page, please. There's a response, in fact, on the Monday morning at 9:50. No, the Mayor isn't required, but the PM has asked for a separate meeting to take place with a Cabinet Minister. Let's just look, if we may, at another set of emails, this time internal at number 10 to show how that decision to refuse not to invite you on that occasion was reached. So if we can look at 214135, please. At the bottom of that page, we see the same email from your member of staff. And then if we look going up the page, first of all, Claire Brunton says to emails saying she assumes the answer is no again. And then we see an email from Eddie Lister, who was he not one of Prime Minister's chiefs of staff, or his chief of staff?
Yep.
We heard oral evidence from him saying that no, he thinks, but there does need to be a meeting of mayors, perhaps with Man Hancock. Then another email from Claire Brunton saying that it had been discussed at the 8:15 meeting and that the general view was that there is in fact an argument for you to be at the meeting. And then at the very top, at the sort of final response from Eddie Lister, you can't have him without Street, Burnham et al. Reference to the mayors of Birmingham and Manchester, or is London more important than Manchester? And we heard from Lord Lister that reflected his view. In other words, one either invited all of the metro mayors, to use that term, or none of them, and that is why, as we saw in the previous document, you were not invited. What's your reaction to that analysis and that reasoning behind you not being invited to Cobra at that stage?
Well, firstly, I think it may well have been sensible to invite Andy Street, Andy Burnham and other metro mayors to Cobra meetings rather than bilaterals. But secondly, they knew then, I knew subsequently, that London was different. I knew subsequently London was different because I was subsequently told that the pandemic was having an impact on London ahead of the rest of the country. The government were aware the challenges in ICU, the challenges in our hospital, and the government were aware about community transmission in London. So there is an argument for London to be treated differently at this particular time. But secondly, actually, we know, and it was the case then and it was the case in 2009, there is an ability for Cobra to have some people join in virtually anyway. So there's no reason at all why others couldn't join as well.
I wanted to pursue that point with you. We've already seen that the sort of headline reason, the justification for the request for you to be at the Cobra was because London was special in this context. And we'll come back to that. But the other point you made was, well, why not invite the metro mayors? I mean, we know that the devolved administrations were being invited to Cobra at that stage. Leaving aside what you thought was, and as it turned out was in fact, sort of advanced position of London, imagine it was just a national emergency with no particular region ahead of the other. In that context, do you think there's an argument for inviting a series of metro mayors to a meeting like this?
It depends on the circumstances. So, for example, I had no objection when there was a terrorist attack in an arena in Manchester for the metro mayor being present for those Cobras, because obviously it affects Manchester. But we know, look, London's population, as you've said before, is more than 9 million. It's more than Scotland and Wales put together. For example, did those Cobra know most people in London travel by bus or tube? More than 5 million journeys by bus, more than 4 million by tube. So the transmission is going to happen very, very quickly of this virus. How many of those around Cobra knew issues around diversity, comorbidity, intergenerational households, overcrowded accommodation? How many people around Cobra knew, for example, in London, there are more people who work on 0 hours contract, work in the gig economy, work in frontline jobs where they can catch this virus? And so my point being is, look, it's horses for courses. In this particular case, I can see no explanation at all why, the GLA, the Mayor of London, we weren't around that table. I think lives could have been saved if we were earlier.
That was Monday, the 9th of March. That Cobra meeting, the second Cobra meeting to which you were not invited, took place. I want to move on and now ask you about a meeting that took place a couple of days later on Wednesday, the 11th of March, that was a day on which you and some of your staff met with Chris Whitty. And shall we look first of all at a record of that meeting? It's up on screen now. Before I ask you about the detail of this document, Mr. Khan, there are a few documents like this amongst the exhibits to your statement. They are transcripts, and most of them, like this one, say that they're a transcript of David Bellamy. He was your chief of staff, was he not?
Correct, he still is, yeah.
So can we take it that documents like this are typed up versions of contemporaneous written notes that he took at meetings like this?
Correct. His handwritten notes are awful to read, and so I think that the typed version means you can read what he's written. But I think the handwritten notes have been disclosed as well.
Yes, yes. Just so everyone knows, that's what these documents are. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of entries on this document, the notes of the meeting that you had with Chris Whitty on that Wednesday, the 11th of March. First of all, only 2 lines down, we see an entry, CMO, that's Chris Whitty, saying this is going to be a global pandemic, and then some detail. Did Chris Whitty give you detail there that you hadn't previously understood?
Well, firstly, it's just worth explaining. This meeting was at my request. I'd contacted his office and said, look, we know about this pandemic. I'd like to meet with you to discuss this. Secondly, just to clarify, Mr. O'Connor, the 2nd of March was the first time I was aware of Cobra, but there had been many Cobras in February, as you're well aware, and in January. And so this was me asking to meet Chris Whitty, and although I'd read the phrase global pandemic, Chris Whitty telling me there's going to be a global pandemic, was shocking to hear from him. But it's the first time I'd met with him since we knew about this virus, and he was telling me this is going to be a global pandemic.
Mr. Khan, could you go slower? I'm sorry, there is a stenographer.
I do apologise.
No, it's easily done, I understand.
Let's just scroll down a little, please. Yes. Can you see the paragraph there that says, think actual number 5 to 10,000, actual UK number 5 to 10,000, London lead as transport hub and density no more than 2 to 3 weeks. What was the information that Chris Whitty was giving you there?
So what Professor Whitty was telling us was the numbers of people in London he thought had the virus, the reasons why we were, if you like, ahead of the others, why it was worse in London, because we are a transport hub, airports, Eurostar, etc., and our density, the disease can be passed far quicker because we're a dense city. I think the reference to no more than 2 to 3 weeks is in relation to before things get really bad. Because if you see later on, he mentions priorities next week, 2 to 3 weeks. He was worried, although about the virus, about its impact on London. That's how I received it.
And just picking up on the point about London, the position in London being ahead of the rest of the country, if we could just go down a few more lines, please. Yes. If you can see just a little bit above the bottom of the screen there, there's an entry, get timing right for London, too early for others, but regional approach is too confusing. That again seems to be consistent with the idea that London is ahead of the rest of the country, and the measures that were being planned were going to be designed to address the position in London, even if it meant they might be a bit early for the rest of the country. Is that right?
Without a doubt. I mean, look, it's difficult to articulate the impact this meeting had on me in relation to hearing this from the CMO. It was quite clear it was coming our way, this virus, and we'd be affected badly, but also the response from him was trying to explain to me the reasons why the other parts of the country weren't yet affected, because us being the transport hub and so forth. It made sense when he explained it the way he did.
And in summary, what Professor Whitty was telling you at this meeting was confirming, obviously also adding much more detail, the consideration, the suspicion that you had before, which is that London, because of its status as a transport hub and proximity of so many people living together, would be ahead of the rest of the country in the development of the virus?
Absolutely. I think at this stage, Mr. O'Connor, we may have had an example where a school had pupils who had the virus, and that school may have closed down because of a skiing holiday in Italy. So that was also the fore of my mind. I was aware that the virus was in London because of the school closure, but it's clear from what Chris Hughty was saying, the impact on London was going to be huge. An example of how I received it was that week I decided to cancel the St Patrick's Day event on the Sunday, just on the basis of what Chris Hughty had told me and about the impact of the virus. This was in advance of me going to the first Cobra. I think St Patrick's Day was going to take place, the event in Trafalgar Square, that Sunday.
Yeah. Let's pick up the chronology again then. So that was the Wednesday, the 11th of March. At the end of that, the next day, in fact, on Thursday, the 12th of March, there was another Cobra meeting. We can look briefly at another of these email exchanges. 1118843, please. Quite a familiar exchange by now at the top half of the page. An email on that day, early at lunchtime on the 12th of March, to Claire Brunton, asking if you could attend. Presumably the meeting was in the afternoon. Simply repeating the request, really, and saying we think it's important he's there representing London. And the answer comes back, checked with the team, I'm afraid not. You've already described your frustration at not having been at the earlier meetings, presumably coming the day after your meeting with Professor Whitty. Perhaps you were even more frustrated at that.
Well, can I just go back to a point you mentioned about the powers or lack of in relation to NPIs? So the only powers I had was to do things like enhanced cleaning on the underground, which I did that week, cancelling St Patrick's Day on the Sunday. So that's me not being properly briefed by everybody, but just by the CMO. So yeah, so frustrated is a fair understatement.
We then go into the weekend. You've mentioned you cancelled the St Patrick's Day event. There was yet another Cobra meeting on Monday the 16th. Of course, the inquiry has had a lot of evidence about meetings and so on that took place at Downing Street in the Cabinet Office on the Friday the 13th and then over that weekend, in fact. But then there was another Cobra meeting on Monday the 16th of March, and on this occasion you were invited to attend. Were you given an explanation at that point as to why you were being invited then but hadn't been invited previously?
No.
Let's look, if we may, back at your witness statement where you provide an account of that meeting on Monday the 16th. It's paragraphs 82 and 83 on page 19 of your statement. We can see then at paragraph 82, you refer to attending that meeting on the Monday, the 16th. You refer it being stated at the meeting that London was, quote, a few weeks ahead of the rest of the country. And then in the paragraph below, you say that this was a moment you'll never forget. Can you expand on all of that for us, please?
I mean, I was told for the first time by the Prime Minister and others how bad things were. I'd been briefed by the CMO the week earlier, but not with the colour that the Cobra meeting presented the challenges in London. We're now told that just the concentrations of the cases in ICUs in London are really serious. The Prime Minister is using words like, this is the biggest challenge we're going to face since the Second World War. Draconian measures are going to be needed. And this is not in any way, sort of delusions of grandeur, but I'd been kept in the dark as the elected Mayor of London. And I felt almost winded in relation to what was happening in London, but also realising there are things we could have done in relation to some of these issues. Some we did, St Patrick's Day, enhanced cleaning on the underground. Others we didn't do. And I was quite clear, not in any way to sound panic-driven, but I was alarmed by what I was being told in relation to where we were and where we may go to And I will never forget that sort of feeling of lack of power, lack of influence, not knowing what's happening in our city.
Now,
So can I just ask what you would have done? I mean, you'd been told on the 11th of March by the CMO that there was going to be a global pandemic and it was coming to London and the impact was going to be huge. You said you had limited powers. Had you, supposing that message had come from government as opposed to Chris Whitty, who obviously is a government employee, what would you have done differently in those 5 days?
Some of the things that happened subsequently. So it was me that lobbied the Prime Minister to go to lockdown. It was me that lobbied the Prime Minister in relation to the inability to keep social distance on public transport, so people shouldn't be using public transport unless they had to.
So we're talking about lobbying. We're not talking about specific actions because your powers are limited.
Well, that's the joy of Cobra, my lady, that you can put your views forward to people with the power and they can take power. So because Cobra is chaired by the Prime Minister, he can act, if you like, as a referee between different points of view between the Cabinet, but also he takes some more representations from somebody at the coalface of London and can respond. So I'll give you an example in relation to some of the lobbying in the absence of power to the Prime Minister that led to action. The lockdown was...
Well, I think Mr O'Connor's going to come to that. I'm sorry, my question may have preempted.
The point I was making, my lady, was had I been at earlier Cobras, I could have pointed out some of the reasons why community transmission was going to accelerate in London. Because I wasn't present there, those views weren't heard and weren't responded to.
Thank you.
as Mike says, Mr. Khan, let's come then to the next period. We know there was a week, in fact, between that Cobra meeting we were just discussing on Monday the 16th and the following Monday when the national lockdown was announced by the Prime Minister. And you had a number of exchanges with the Prime Minister during that week. And first of all, I want to ask you about a meeting that took place on the Thursday of that week, Thursday the 19th, which you give us some detail about in your witness statement. If we could go on, please, to paragraph 88 of your witness statement. You say here that you requested a meeting with the Prime Minister, and it would appear that request was granted, and it was on that day, the Thursday the 19th, that you and your Chief of Staff, David Bellamy, actually went in person to Downing Street and had a meeting with the Prime Minister. Moving on in your statement to paragraph 89, please. You describe, if we can go to the rest of the paragraph, please, over the page, drawing on your knowledge of what was happening in other countries. You say many other countries had introduced some form of lockdown by this point. You felt strongly that, in summary, hospitality venues should be closed, and this is something that you said to the Prime Minister at that point. Is that right?
It is, but can I explain? We had a massive advantage as a country, which is that the pandemic was happening elsewhere weeks in advance of us. So we could see what was working elsewhere and see what wasn't working. And it seemed to me that advantage wasn't being used. And so we knew from the proactive work we'd done from City Hall what was happening elsewhere. I'd spoken to the leaders of other cities around the world to see what actions they had taken, and we were an outlier.
The inquiry has heard that the sort of number 10 machine, if you like, politicians, civil servants, scientists, had spent much of the weekend before this Thursday locked in meetings, trying to understand the data, discussing which NPIs should be imposed. A series of NPIs had been imposed, had they not, a day or two before this Thursday. And certainly the evidence we've heard is that what came to be described as lockdown had been considered and was under consideration during this period. Is that something you understood at the meeting, or did you think you were raising something that the Prime Minister hadn't already heard?
No, it was clear. It was clear that some of these things had been surfaced, but the Prime Minister wasn't persuaded. So I'll give you an example in relation to my surprise. The Prime Minister wasn't aware that in other parts of the world they had lockdowns in place and fines could be issued if you breached the lockdown. I was surprised he wasn't aware of that in relation to what's happening elsewhere.
He said that, did he?
Yeah, because my chief of staff gave the example of Milan in relation to the imposition of fines. The Prime Minister wasn't aware, for example, in France there were some tensions because Parisians were going to other parts of the country, and so it was important to keep people confined to where they were. And that was the conversation we were having, and I was surprised at the lack of awareness of some of these things.
You go on in your statement, Mr. Khan, to describe the exchanges at this meeting, and in summary, tell me if I've got this right, you and Mr. Johnson agreed that there would be a press conference that day, later on the Thursday, where you would both appear together and ask hospitality venues to close. And subsequently, you got a message to say that wasn't, sorry, I've leapt ahead. You then left Downing Street to go back to City Hall to prepare for the press conference, but you then got a message to say that there'd been second thoughts and that the press conference wasn't going to go ahead after all. Is that I'm going to take you to that particular part of your witness statement in a moment, but is that a summary of what was discussed at the meeting?
It is, but it's just worth explaining. It was quite clear during the meeting that the Prime Minister was hesitant to bring in measures. I made the point to him, look, you're a libertarian, I'm somebody who's passionate about human rights. If we're both saying to London, we've got to have restrictions, that is really powerful. You're Conservative, I'm Labour. It's a really powerful thing for both of us to be addressing London. And that point landed with Dom Cummings and with the Prime Minister, I thought. And he said, you're right, let's have a press conference together. And so I left Downing Street to return to City Hall, because it was going to be some hours later, the press conference, so I could get my words together and so forth.
Let's just look, if we may, at paragraph 92 and towards the end of that paragraph, because it's here that you describe, after you've gone back to City Hall, receiving a call from Dominic Cummings to say that the decision had been made not to go ahead with the press conference. But his explanation for that partly was that the matter would be discussed further at Cobra the next day, but also this, he was concerned about the impact on the financial markets and thought an announcement on the Friday, as the markets were about to close for the weekend, would be better. Now, one of the broad themes the inquiry is addressing is this question of balancing economic considerations against the health benefits of imposing MPIs. That would seem to be a perfectly logical way of balancing those competing considerations on one view, Mr. Khan.
In isolation, yes, but what it does, it avoids the link between lives and livelihoods, the link between the health of individuals and the health of the economy. We know, and they knew at the time, that community transmission means people catch this virus very, very quickly, which inhibits their ability to be good workers, productive workers, and so forth. So I couldn't disagree with him saying the impact on the markets and so forth. My frustration, further 24 hours of this virus spreading, what impact would that have on the financial markets, on our productivity, and so forth?
It's an example of, in this case, the Prime Minister trying to balance the health impacts against the economic impacts of taking these decisions.
We didn't get a chance to discuss it.
Well, you're right. He'd already taken that decision and told you of his decision.
That's right.
We see there a reference to the Cobra for the next day. That was Friday, the 20th of March. You attended that Cobra meeting as well, did you not?
Yes, I did, yeah.
And it was this Cobra meeting, if we look at paragraph 94 of your statement, please, about 4 lines down, you say, the PM was not at this Cobra meeting, which I found extraordinary given the circumstances. Did you ask, were you told why the Prime Minister was not at that Cobra meeting?
I can't remember. It must have been raised, but I can't remember the explanation why he wasn't there.
Do you remember having any reaction to whatever explanation you were given?
It surprised me because one of the huge advantages of the Prime Minister chairing Cobra is often, not unreasonably, there'll be different points of view. And the Prime Minister, as the boss, can arbitrate on the different points of view. To paraphrase you, can balance those points of view. And with respect to Michael Gove as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, if there was a difference, it's quite difficult for him to arbitrate and decide, although to give Michael Gove credit, he did.
In any event, you can't. We may well hear from Mr. Johnson, but you can't remember why it was that he wasn't at that meeting. Later on in this paragraph, you describe a sort of shifting. Initially, the meeting being in favour of pushing off the closure of hospitality venues into the weekend, but a counter-argument being made that it should be that day, at the end of the day on that Friday.
That's right.
And in the end, that other argument, the Friday argument, prevailing.
That's right. This was to Michael Gove's credit. He decided to agree with those of us lobbying for Friday night rather than Saturday.
There's one more sequence of exchanges between you and the Prime Minister that I want to ask you about in this sort of part of the chronology, and that is a letter you wrote and then a call you had with him on Sunday, the 22nd of March. Let's look, please, at the letter first. So that is 118939. So let's remind ourselves, as I say, Mr. Khan, this was the Sunday just before the lockdown was announced. In fact, the next day. One gets the impression from your statement you were at home on that day, but you wrote this letter from home.
Yep.
And sent it to him by email, one assumes.
Yeah.
If we can go down to about the fourth paragraph, please. Yes, sorry, one more paragraph. Thank you. So we can see in the paragraph that starts, I am hearing time and again, your concerns about the measures that had been imposed to date, and at the end of that paragraph, you refer to the fact that we talked about at some length, that London being a few weeks ahead of the rest of the country, and so on. And it's in the next paragraph that you make your sort of request or you advocate a particular step that you think the Prime Minister ought to take. You say there needs to be an immediate strengthening of the public health message to London. Advice is being seen as something that can be ignored. You say, I do not use the phrase lockdown lightly, but I believe Londoners must be told to stay home unless they are an essential worker, are buying food or collecting medication from pharmacists. Alongside this, there must be clear reassurances and so on. So you are at that point advocating for what became known as a mandatory lockdown. If we could just go over the page, please, one more paragraph. You say this at the end of the letter. Alternatively, if you insist on continuing with the same course, by inference that means not adopting a mandatory lockdown, I will be left with no choice but to speak directly to Londoners with a tougher message if it means thousands of people's lives could be saved. What do you mean by, I mean, that you're not threatening him, but you are indicating that if he doesn't do what you're asking to him, you will take a different course. What exactly were you proposing there?
Well, in a crisis, it's really important there's one message being given to citizens, otherwise that can lead to confusion. My frustration at the lack of clarity from the government's messaging, don't use public transport, but go to work. These shops are closed down, you can go out and about and keep town centres busy and so forth, was leading to confusion. And the point I was trying to get across is, if it's the case, and I knew this from the conversation I had with him and Dom Cummins on the Thursday, if it's the case you yourself, for a variety of reasons, don't want to have a stricter message, I will say to Londoners, do certain things to save your lives, which will save livelihoods.
So, as we've explored, it wouldn't have been open to you to order a mandatory lockdown yourself. what you're describing there is, as it were, departing from the government's messaging. You would be saying something different to the government. You would be encouraging Londoners to do more by way of staying at home and so on than the national government was telling them.
Yeah, I have very limited statutory powers in relation to the NPIs for the reasons you've said. It's about messaging.
Yeah. So that was a letter that was sent by email to the Prime Minister on that Sunday. And it's right, isn't it, that you spoke to the Prime Minister on the telephone later that day?
That's right.
And if we could have on screen, please, 118944. Now, this is a similar transcript. Are you able to help us with who wrote this? It doesn't say it was Mr. Bellamy that wrote it.
No, this is written by, I think, Ali Picton, who's the Director of Operations in my office.
And was he listening into the call?
She was, yeah. I mean,
Sorry,
when it goes through switch, you can have more than two people on a call. The number 10 down is straight as a switch, and they connect more than two people on the call.
So this was a note taken by your official of the call between you and Mr. Johnson.
That's right.
On that day. And we can see then there was a discussion which, as it were, continued the debate from your letter, because we can see in the first line that Mr. Johnson saying he'd seen that letter. One of the things that's notable about this conversation is that Mr. Johnson repeatedly stresses his concern about the economic cost of the lockdown, Mr. Khan. If we scroll down a little, yes, so if we see the entry saying, starting BJ will talk to team overnight, we can see at the end of that entry he's saying, but this comes at great economic cost. Just scroll down a little further, please. So the entry starting, it's better if we can coordinate as much as possible. Again, he goes on to say, there's a trade-off. We can't just completely screw up the economy. And then still further down onto the next page, please. That first entry at the top of the next page, again, Mr. Johnson is saying we don't want to cripple the economy. I'll ask you about that in a minute, but more generally, was it your understanding at this stage on the Sunday that Mr. Johnson still hadn't decided in his own mind whether to take that step of imposing a mandatory lockdown?
That's right.
And then help us, these repeated references to the economy,
Sure.
Does that give us a clue as to what Mr. Johnson was thinking on that day?
I mean, you'll see from the contemporaneous records of our meetings, I'd raised the issue of the economy as well. The first time I met with him, I raised the issue of my concern about those in zero hours contract, those in the gig economy. And in fact, after the first Cobra written to the Prime Minister and suggested a sub-Cobra dealing with the economy, so I was also cognizant of the impact on the economy. I was also aware by this stage a lot of Londoners had already lost their lives. I think 148 Londoners had lost their lives by this Sunday. And the point I was trying to get across to the Prime Minister was the link, as I said, between lives and livelihoods. And actually, had we got a grip of the virus earlier and had an earlier lockdown, in my view, it had been shorter and had less of an impact on the economy.
We'll come back to this point in the context of the debates later in the year, Mr. Khan, but tell us what your understanding was of how the discussion was left at the end of this call. Had Mr. Johnson made his mind up, or was he saying that he would reflect further and let you know?
Oh, no, it's quite clear from you'll see the last four interactions that he was considering what I'd said, but he hadn't been persuaded to the points I was making. You'll see it ends by saying, let's speak again tomorrow.
Yes. Did you, in fact, speak again the next morning? We know that the next day, at the end of the day, Mr. Johnson made his announcement, but did you, the two of you, speak again, or can you not remember?
I suspect by the next morning we'd have known there's a Cobra taking place that day, which may be the reason why we didn't speak.
Yes. In any event, it's right, isn't it, that it was the next day after the Cobra that the announcement was made that the mandatory lockdown was to come into force.
That's right.
Let me move on. I've got a couple of shortish series of questions to ask you perhaps before we have a break. Following the imposition of the lockdown, there were concerns, were there not, about the availability and the way in which the availability of PPE within London and the way in which it was being passed out, allocated to the workers who needed it. If we look at paragraph 292 of your statement, you address this issue there. It's on page 64. Now, as you observe, Mr. Khan, this is going to be this issue will be the subject of another module within the inquiry, so I'm not going to take you into great detail about PPE. But as we can see, this was a matter that concerned you in the early months of the first lockdown. Perhaps you can just explain in general terms what you understood to be the problem.
So if I explain, so one of the things I was doing was chairing a London leaders meeting, and that was the leaders of councils who are responsible for a lot of social care. And they were telling me the challenges they had in getting personal protective equipment to their social care workers who were in the front line looking after people in social care. There was a separate conversation from those in the police service, those in transport, those elsewhere about what kit they should have. And there was a separate lobbying taking place from those in the healthcare profession about a lack of proper PPE for their members as well. Your point earlier on about the role of the mayor, what it means is you've got lots of different people coming to me raising concerns, from health workers to council leaders responsible for social care to those bodies that I'm responsible for and others. And I was articulating to the Secretary of State the concerns that were being raised to me and asking for a proper response.
And one of the themes that appear to have been raised, and which you refer to there, was a logistical issue. So not so much whether the PPE was available, but how it was passed out to those who needed it. And we can see this referred to, in fact, not in the letter you refer to in that paragraph, but a slightly later one. If we can go, please, to 118830. So this is a letter of the 13th of April, Mr. Khan, although you refer in it to an earlier letter, or two earlier letters of the 31st of March and the 8th of April. And it's the first paragraph underneath the heading PPE, where you refer to what you describe, it's a phrase that comes up twice in this paragraph, inconsistent supply of PPE. Was that an issue that you were concerned about, it would seem, both in March and as late as the 13th of April?
Absolutely. I mean, just to be clear, I was hearing stories about care workers, doing DIY PPE because there was no PPE in some of these care homes.
And so is this then an example of you raising these problems that you had heard through that sort of web of contacts that you had?
Absolutely.
Without going into detail, were these problems resolved in your experience, or did they carry on?
They carried on for some time. At some stage later on, we offered the London Fire Brigade to take responsibility for logistics, so they would be sent a lot of the PPE, be told where it needs to go, and the LFB would organise in Croydon from where the PPE should go. That happened sometime later, though.
One more topic, it's related, which is the question of face coverings. Can we look, please, at paragraph 170 of your statement on page 38? And just to be clear, in broad terms, when we speak of PPE, we are talking about specialist kit provided to emergency services, healthcare staff, and so on. In contrast, this debate that you engaged with about face coverings was really focused on people, ordinary people, not necessarily at all associated with the emergency services or healthcare staff, whether they should wear, as we'll see, in many cases, homemade or simple fabric face coverings.
Okay, because your question raises a really important point, which is there was an understandable concern about finite PPE. was being rationed as a consequence. So I deliberately used the word face mask where I could avoid it, because that would conflate a finite rationed resource with something that's available infinite, which is face coverings, which you can make at home and all the rest of it, which in itself, we'll come to later on, I hope, can be really helpful in stopping the virus spreading.
Yes, so that there is that distinction, and that we're on the right ground. And as you say, this is something that you advocated for over some time, was it not, during the pandemic?
I think the first time I wrote to the government about this was in early April.
Yes, well, I'm going to take you to that letter in a moment. But just to the starting point, Mr. Khan, you say here at paragraph 170 that in the very early stages of the pandemic, particularly before the first national lockdown, the effectiveness of wearing a face covering as a general public health measure was unclear. Just want to ask you whether it was at that stage particularly unclear, because in fact in this paragraph, and I think the paragraph that follows, you then recite a series of sort of views or judgments made by individual scientists, scientific bodies, the World Health Organization, who were all in fact unanimous in the early stages that face masks were not going to be a helpful tool. Face coverings were not going to be helpful or useful in the context of this pandemic. That's right, isn't it?
That's very fair. And this is the point about, as the scientific knowledge evolves, as we discover more, because thankfully we've got the virus after others, we can see what's working elsewhere and then learn from it. And this is a really good example of initially the view being face coverings don't really make much of a difference. Very soon, though, across the globe, and including in our very own SAGE on the 21st of April, the evidence and the conclusions changed, yet the decisions taken by our government didn't.
Well, just focusing, though, just grounding ourselves on this very early stage, as you recite, there was really, certainly within the UK scientific community, a consensus that they weren't helpful.
Up until April the 20th, yeah.
Including, we haven't touched on STAC, that stands for the London Scientific and Technical Advice Cell. In summary, is this right? It was your own London sort of version of SAGE.
That's a very fair summary.
So you in fact asked them about face coverings, having seen what SAGE had said, and they agreed. We can see here they provided a briefing note suggesting that the disadvantages would outweigh the benefits.
That's fair.
So that, at least, was the context for the letter that you've just mentioned. And let's look at that, please. It's 118829. I think you said this was the first letter you wrote on this issue, Mr. Khan.
I should explain, the Prime Minister was unwell in hospital, yeah. So Dominic had taken over, and so that's why I was writing to Dominic Raab rather than the Prime Minister.
Indeed. So we will, this is something we've already heard evidence about, but by the 8th of April, Dominic Raab was taking the place of the Prime Minister because of his illness. Now, in the first line of this letter, you refer there to the use of non-medical face coverings. And does this pick up on the point you've already made, which is that you were wanting to distinguish what we've been describing as face coverings from the sort of PPE-style specialist equipment?
Spot on. The other key word in that first line is reviews. As your point, I appreciate that the initial view may have been not sensible use, but I'm saying to the government, review that in light of what I go on to say.
Yeah, and in fact, just to finish off this point, if we could briefly look at the end of this letter on the next page. Yes, so the paragraph starting, I recognise, you are there explicitly recognising that there is there is an issue about reserving specialist equipment for those in the NHS and other services who need it, and that you are expressly not talking about competing with them.
Exactly.
For these face coverings. But then, if we can just go back to the first page, please. Most of this letter is taken up with you referring to other countries where the practice is different, and countries where in one way or another, face coverings among the general population have been encouraged, some in different settings than others.
That's right. Our own research has shown, from the Centre for Controlled Disease in the USA to the Chief Medical Officer in Canada to these other mayors from cities we were speaking to, that they were using face coverings to, if you've got the virus, it could be asymptomatic. It prevents the droplets spreading to somebody else who may catch it. I'd also, in April, read articles in the BMJ and Lancet, which are also talking about how useful face coverings can be.
And so if we just scroll down, we can see you refer to the Austrian government, then there are a series of examples taken from the United States, and a little bit further down, I think, to the last one, Canada.
Have I misrecorded? I thought you said that your expert advisory body said on the 6th of April that the disadvantages outweighed the benefits.
That's right. So there was two things happening. One is the evidence given by Professor Paul Plant to the London Health Assembly. Two is the work of STAC, which is just the London, call it SAGE for shorthand. In addition, you had all this stuff taking place across the globe. So I'm asking the government to review, because they've got the advantage of SAGE. STAC's not quite SAGE. And so I'm asking the government to review the advice from SAGE based upon all these things that I point to.
So is the answer, did I misrecord? I thought you'd said the 6th of April advice you received from your expert body was the disadvantages.
Outweigh, correct.
Have I got it right or wrong?
You've got it correct.
Right. So had anything changed between the 6th of April and your writing this letter of the 8th of April? So you'd had expert advice, disadvantages outweigh advantages, and then on the 8th of April you referenced what's happening abroad. Had anything changed in those 2 days?
The evidence from abroad, which I'd managed to get together from our own desktop research, which I'm not sure whether STAC had. So I'm saying, look, I've done this research. Can you review your expert advice based upon this research that I've gathered?
Thank you.
I'm conscious of time. Just a couple of final points to finish off this point, Mr. Khan, if I may. Your witness statement addressing this issue then takes us through the following months, where bit by bit, as you've said, the scientific advice changed, and stage by stage, the UK government changed its advice, and then it's mandatory. It imposed various mandatory conditions about where face coverings had to be worn, different places on transport networks, and so on. And just with that in mind, I'd like to take you to look at paragraph 184 and 185 of your witness statement on page 41. Um, 184 refers to a letter from Matt Hancock, in fact replying, no, not replying to the letter we've just looked at, but one which had been written a few days later, but stating that government expert groups had considered that face masks, rather had considered the use of face masks, decided there was not sufficient evidence to recommend their use, but that they are currently re-reviewing the position in the light of the latest available evidence. And then you say this: I was disappointed by this response, which I felt gave short shrift to the legitimate concerns that you had repeatedly raised on face coverings. Notwithstanding the science...
I think this is going too political, the second part.
Well, can I just ask you a general question, Mr. Khan? We've heard a lot in this inquiry about following the science. Is it fair to say that on this issue of face coverings, the UK government did, in fact, follow the science in the sense of repeatedly asking expert bodies to review the position, and when the scientific understanding changed, more or less, changing the guidance, in some cases, making mandatory requirements? So in that context, at a high level, were they not, in fact, on one view, acting appropriately?
No, because the SAGE group of experts who concluded face coverings would make a difference concluded that on April the 21st. The use of face coverings only in public transport became mandatory some months later in June. The use of face coverings in shops only became mandatory in late July. The use of face coverings in museums, galleries and so forth only became mandatory in August. Had the government been following the scientific evidence, after that stage meeting on April 21st, they have advised people, in fact made it mandatory, to wear face coverings on public transport, shops, museums and galleries from the end of April, rather than eventually August.
Yes. Right, Mr. Khan. I'm not going to ask any more about that issue. I wonder if that's a convenient moment.
Certainly, I shall return at 12:05. We shall complete your evidence before we break for lunch, Mr. Khan.
All rise.
Mr O'Connor.
Mr Khan, I want to move on and ask you some questions about your engagement with, first of all, other mayors within England, and secondly, with the leaders of the devolved administrations during the pandemic. So, addressing the mayors first, of course, we have had a discussion about the sense in which London was a special case in those early weeks and months of the pandemic, the virus being ahead in London compared to other parts of the country. But it's right, isn't it? You describe in your witness statement, following the first lockdown, a degree of engagement and discussion between you and the other elected mayors in the country.
Yeah, just explain that at the time, I think there were 9 metro mayors across the country, and we meet regularly. We met more regularly during the pandemic, and it's cross-party. Yes. I think there were 2 Conservative, 7 Labour, and it's a very collegiate forum for us to discuss what's happened in our respective regions.
Just let me interrupt you. Let's look, if we may, at paragraph 48 of your witness statement, where you address this issue. The M9, M10 group of mayors, and as you say, that the number increased by 1 during the pandemic. Do we take it from what you just said that this was an arrangement that predated the pandemic?
Yeah, we used to meet less frequently before the pandemic, and we've become less frequent since the pandemic ended. But during the course of the pandemic, lots of regular meetings, and our staff were on first name terms because of the good collaborative working.
And then if we scroll down to the next paragraph of the statement, you then talk about calls with leaders of the devolved administrations. Was this something that took place between you and individual leaders of the devolved administrations, or was it linked in some way to the M9, M10 meetings?
No, these were separate meetings between me and the respective First Ministers that took place after my invitation to the first Cobra. And when Michael Gove took over some of the work when Boris Johnson was in hospital, we'd meet the First Ministers and myself with Michael Gove and others.
What were the themes of the discussions, both between you and the other mayors, and separately with your discussions with the leaders of the devolved administrations?
It was sharing our experiences in our respective areas, what was working, what wasn't working, some of the papers that have been presented at Cobra, our responses to those sort of conversations, sometimes with the CDL, Michael Gove present, other times us meeting separately.
Yeah. There is one example that you give later on in your witness statement. It's paragraph 236 on page 51. So this is an example of a call with First Ministers of the devolved nations in May, and you record there everyone apparently expressing concern that the government wasn't engaging sufficiently, a feeling there'd been a coordinated and a deliberate shift in the government's approach. Can you just expand on that? What sort of shift, and shift in what direction?
Yeah, I think the last Cobra had happened on the 10th of May, and there was a concern about the mixed messages. On the one hand, ostensibly return to work. On the other hand, don't use public transport. And there was a concern that there were these mixed messages without speaking to us and our experiences on the coalface. I'd argue Nicola Sturgeon or Mark Drayford or Arlene Foster knows a lot more what's happening in their respective regions than a civil servant in Whitehall or DFT. And that was the frustration that they were sharing with me. That was my frustration in London as well.
Yeah. We've seen evidence that at around this time, and then as 2020 progressed, Mark Drakeford and others, he in particular, was writing letters asking for more Cobra meetings. Is this part of that same dialogue?
Correct. I mean, from memory, the last Cobra I attended was the 10th of May. I'm not aware if there were other Cobras with the First Ministers and without me. But it goes to my point earlier on, Mr. O'Connor, about the usefulness of Cobra in relation to that place where you can all come together, discuss these things. And there's a huge strength, by the way, being cross-party, because you take away the single message and you've agreed it after discussion. Those weren't happening.
We've heard evidence from others, Mr. Khan, that notwithstanding those benefits of Cobra, the view was taken that it was just Cobra is best utilised as a short-term measure, and that it wasn't an appropriate sort of forum to coordinate long-term pandemic management. What's your view about that?
Whether the meeting's held in Cobra or elsewhere, you can't be colleagues working together collegially. It needs to be one where the Prime Minister's there because he's the gravitas of being the Prime Minister. He can pull a lever and things will happen, but have everyone around the table. And there was an absence of these meetings between the 10th of May until September, by which stage things got really bad. I wasn't invited to the September ones. In my view, had there been better processes, that have led to better decision-making. In my view, poor process leads to poor judgment, leads to poor decision-making, and that's what we saw here.
All right. I'm going to move on, Mr. Khan, and just ask you a few questions on the subject of inequalities. There will be others who ask you more detailed questions on that issue shortly. You've already mentioned in the course of your oral evidence that one of the group of duties, responsibilities that you have as Mayor is a duty to consider structural health inequalities and to prepare a strategy to address those inequalities. Is that right?
That's right.
We know that from a very early stage of the pandemic, it became apparent that the virus was having an unequal effect, and in particular on ethnic groups within London, that they had a more severe, pronounced effect on them. Is that something that you became aware of at an early stage?
It was, yeah.
How did you become aware of it?
It was clear from a number of metrics. One is if you see the photographs of the first 10 doctors who lost their lives, the thing that strikes you is they're all people of colour. We knew, for example, in relation to transport workers, I'm afraid in London we lost 105 transport workers. They lost their lives. I would write to every transport worker whose details I had, their bereaved families, and I noticed the names I was writing were all ethnic minority names. We knew from the conversations with health workers, from social care workers, from transport workers, the issue of disproportionality. The phrase I used at the time is, we all might be facing the same storm, but people are in different sized boats.
Can I just ask you to look at a particular document in this respect, Mr. Khan, and that is 118888. Now, we mentioned the group, did you call it STAC or STAC, that your version of SAGE in any event? And this is a report that appears to have been prepared by that body, dealing with health inequalities. And it's a relatively early document in terms of the pandemic. It's the 22nd of April. Did you commission this document, or did someone else ask them to do this work?
No, I'd have asked them to look into this.
It's drafted, I think we see at the end of the document, by Professor Kevin Fenton. Yes, if we look perhaps at page 6. And he was the chair of STAC, was he?
If I explain, Kevin took over from Paul Plant. So if you remember the name you gave to me before, Professor Paul Plant, Professor Kevin Fenton took over from Professor Paul Plant. So Kevin became my statutory health advisor.
Yeah. I'm not going to take you all through this report. It's relatively detailed, Mr. Khan, but would it be a fair summary to say that at this early stage it was flagging up the obvious signs of unequal impact and advocating more research, more data, more understanding of the problem?
Absolutely.
We know that it was Professor Fenton who went on to prepare sort of PHE inequality reports later in the year. Did you have any involvement in those? I
spoke to Kevin almost daily, so I can't say what direct involvement I had in the paper, but yeah.
Let me move on, Mr. Khan, and ask you questions about events later in 2020. And for these purposes, if we can start with paragraph 123 of your statement on page 28. And you describe there attending in September of 2020, a summit meeting. It's described as a London COVID-19 summit meeting with representatives of the UK government. We see Matt Hancock, I think he was at that stage Sir Edward Lister, who was the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and on your side, London's political leadership. As you say, a meeting that had been requested by the government to agree the escalation process for London in response to any further outbreaks. I'm going to take you to a slide in a moment, just so we can see in a bit more detail what was being discussed. But can you just introduce it for us and tell us what this meeting was all about?
This was an example of an excellent initiative from the government. Government saying, look, let's work together in relation to a process where central government, regional government, local government can work towards how we decide to escalate the process, and I'd hope de-escalate it as well. And that builds confidence and engenders confidence, but also, very importantly, it means the centre knows what's happening at the coalface, and so it's, that's describing what this meeting was, and I think it was an excellent initiative.
Let's look then, if we can, at 118968. If we start off on the first page. If we go over to page 3, please. We see the date. These were a series of slides that were used at that meeting, Mr. Khan. Is that right?
Yeah, it's basically agreeing the metrics by which we decide to, go up or down.
And then if we go over to page 4, I absolutely am not going to invite us to go into all the detail of this, Mr. Khan, but perhaps the diagram tells a fairly simple story. The phrase that was used was escalation, and does this demonstrate the detailed thinking that was being done about how a process should take place from a consideration of enhanced measures in a particular area, how the debate would take place, starting at the bottom and ending with a decision made by the Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's right.
And I wanted to come to your views on this process, which you've described in your witness statement as being very good. But this was a meeting requested by the government, and as you've said, you regarded it as being a very helpful initiative. Yeah,
we'd done a lot of this work in advance of the meeting, but it really was a good example of them recognising London is different to other parts of the country, maybe, but also you need to have partnership between the centre, regional and local.
And just to be clear, this was something that was agreed prior to the introduction of the so-called tiers system, correct, which came in October.
Correct.
Was there discussion of a possible tier system at that stage, or was this taking place, as it were, completely independently of that plan that was to follow?
It was independent. The tiering came later on, I think, in October-ish from memory.
Do you know, I mean, we can obviously ask others, we have other witnesses today, but do you know whether a similar discussions were being held around the country or not?
I'm not sure if they were, but I would have shared this with the Metro mayors when it came to our meetings, because we did tend to share best practice. So I just said it's an excellent initiative, so I'm sure I shared with the Metro mayors this initiative.
Yeah. So that was the sort of plan for escalation, and as we've said, the meeting was on the 11th of September. In fact, as you also describe in your statement, and as we will come to see, really quite shortly after that, I think we'll look at a letter dated the 18th of September, you were writing to Boris Johnson advocating, in fact, just what this plan anticipated, which is increased measures in London, were you not?
That's right. This is in advance of any tiering system, but yeah.
Let's look at the letter of the 18th of September. It's 118973. Less from you to the Prime Minister, Mr. Khan. Picking it up about 4 paragraphs down, please. You say it's increasingly likely that additional measures will soon be required to slow the spread of the virus. You are of the firm view we should not wait for this virus to again spiral out of control before taking action. and the best thing for both public health and the economy is new restrictions imposed early rather than a full lockdown when it's too late. London was too late into lockdown in March. You say the decision cost lives. We simply cannot afford to be slow to respond again. Now, before I ask you to expand on those views, Mr. Khan, the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence from government officials and also from scientists on SAGE and SPI-M and so on, who were analysing the position at that stage and reaching their own views on, as it became known, a circuit breaker at around this time. Did you have access to your own independent scientific views, which led to this advocacy of a lockdown, or not?
No, our information is from the information we have from the partners we've got across London. They could be because we're seeing more admissions in hospital, more use of ICU in hospitals. It could be in relation to prevalence. There was a problem with a lack of testing, so we're using other metrics to assess how good or bad things were. We also were aware of some of the measures used in other parts of the country because of concerns they had.
All of those things would have been available to the Prime Minister, to SAGE, to the Cabinet?
Yeah. All of it's open source data. At most, the advice from Professor Kevin Fenton, which again was accessible to the government as well. Yes.
So, I mean, there was, as we can probably recall, and we can certainly see in the evidence, a debate that was raging at this time as to whether a circuit breaker should be imposed. You were expressing your view, but not putting before the Prime Minister any new evidence on the subject.
No.
We mentioned the tiers a moment ago, and it was in October that the tiering system was introduced. As I imagine we'll hear later on today, that was the subject of some controversy amongst other mayoral regions, particularly in the northwest. It's apparent from your statement that, in fact, there wasn't the same degree of dispute about the tiering system in London. Is that right?
Because colleagues in the northwest went into a higher tier, so hospitality was seriously affected, and there was a lack of financial support. There wasn't that tension in London because we'd not got to there.
Yes. So exactly. So when the tiers were introduced, you were initially in tier 1.
Correct.
And you actually asked to go up to tier 2. Was that by means of the escalation process that we were just looking at?
Correct. Because the metrics we had, the data we had, was showing us things were getting worse. We were saying, look, let's go into tier 2 to avoid a leapfrog from tier 1 to lockdown, because that will hopefully address some of the concerns we have. That's a good example of partnership working.
Yes. And as you say, that debate was taking place, as we now know, in the run-up to what became the second lockdown.
Yeah, just to complete the story, in advance of the second lockdown in November, I had lobbied the Prime Minister for a circuit breaker. I'd seen the SAGE advice, but also half-term at the end of October was an opportunity for that circuit breaker. The government didn't listen to my lobbying. Subsequently in November, went into lockdown.
Yes, and you describe in your statement your reaction when that lockdown was finally announced. Frustration, but also you make the point about the degree of warning that you received about that decision.
Well, here's the point, Mr. O'Connor. Before lockdown 1, we knew what was happening around the world. We delayed and we dithered. Lockdown 2 may not have been needed had the government taken the advice from SAGE, for example, for a circuit breaker, the lobbying from people like me. So another example of delay necessitating a second lockdown, and that's relevant to your point about crippling our economy. Had action been taken sooner, I argue there would not need to be a lockdown maybe. It means less damage to the economy.
Yes. Yep. Mr. Khan, thank you very much. Those are all my questions. There will now be some questions from others.
Ms Campbell.
Mr. Khan, the questions I ask are on behalf of the COVID-bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland and, in fact, the UK families as well. And I've been granted permission to ask you questions on two topics. The first is the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on certain sectors of our society, and as was alluded earlier, that there are additional questions on that. You said in your witness statement, in fact, on a number of occasions, that it became clear as the pandemic progressed that the crisis had not only exposed but really increased deep-seated inequalities in London and across the country, and that it became clear also that it had disproportionately impacted on our black and minority ethnic communities, those on the lowest incomes, Londoners in particular living in the most deprived areas for whom perhaps overcrowding and poverty may be an issue. And you called this evidence of structural racism at a relatively early stage. Would you agree?
That's what I said, yeah.
Now, you also called for a new social contract that advances the twin causes where we see racial and economic inequality, and you've told us something about that today. But one of the issues that you identified early on was that ethnicity was not being recorded on death certificates, particularly obviously in hospitals, and that the disproportionate impact of COVID on our black and minority ethnic communities therefore was not being properly understood and properly recorded. And I wonder if we can look at a document, please. It's 118895. This is a letter that you wrote to Matt Hancock on the 7th of May 2020, urging him to take action to introduce routine ethnic data collection within death registrations in England. Could we focus in, please, on the top two paragraphs, or perhaps top three paragraphs? We can see the date being the 7th of May 2020. You write to seek the government's urgent action to introduce routine ethnic data collection within death registrations in England. And you set out why that is, that evidence is emerging of how black, Asian and minority ethnic communities may be disproportionately affected by COVID-19, including, sadly, by deaths complicated by this deadly virus. And in the third paragraph, your concerns were that lack of ethnic data recording in death registrations is holding us back from getting a full picture. It would seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you received no immediate reply to that letter. Is that right?
I didn't. A couple of weeks later, I then wrote to the Home Secretary because of my concerns about the lack of response. But it appeared to me the government didn't really understand the issues that I was talking about. You mentioned the phrase structural inequality, structural racism. They can be for direct reasons or indirect reasons. It goes to the point I made to Mr. O'Connor about the advantage of the politicians, the decision makers, and Cobra having their own experiences. It's not a criticism, it's an observation. Very few cabinet members around there probably represent a diverse community, understand overcrowded accommodation can lead to this virus spreading, more so in London. Intergenerational households, often people live with granddad, grandfather, parents. But also, to get around London, you've got to use the buses and tubes. And also, you know that people of black, Asian, minority ethnic background have other illnesses, which means if they get the virus, the consequences are more serious. I didn't realise, if I'm honest, until the pandemic, that we didn't record ethnicity when it came to death certificates. So we're asking a basic question: what percentage of those who have died, who had COVID, are black Caribbean or black African or Pakistani heritage or Bangladesh heritage? I couldn't be told because it wasn't recorded.
And it's right, in fact, you did write to the Home Secretary on the 26th of May, and we have that letter disclosed to us. It wasn't, in fact, until the 22nd of October 2020, so 5 months after you raised this in correspondence, that the government eventually announced that it would be mandating the recording of ethnicity on death certificates. Did you consider, in general terms, that the government were proactive in trying to understand or to identify and address the disproportionate impact of COVID on our BAME communities?
No. If you read the letter from the junior minister to me, I was given short shrift. There was no understanding of why it's important, but also no action. And by the way, still to this date, the ethnicity of people is not recorded in the death certificate. It is in Scotland, by the way, not in England or Wales.
Thank you.
Or Northern Ireland.
Yes. And moving then to Northern Ireland, I want to ask you, please, about the issue of communication and what you have identified as an absence of engagement by central government with regional and local leaders on decision making. You raise this as a concern in your statement, and you give an example in your witness statement that on the 10th of May 2020, you attended a Cobra meeting and that one of the First Ministers there present urged the government to engage in meaningful conversation, saying that leaders should not be reading each other's positions in newspapers. Was that a concern that you shared in May 2020?
It was a concern I shared in March as well. If you recall, one of the reasons why, after my first Cobra, I asked to meet Boris Johnson was because of things I was seeing in the newspaper about what the government was considering. It was a common theme in relation to, at various stages during the pandemic, us discovering stuff in the media. And the conversations I had with Nicola, Mark and Arlene and Michelle was us sharing our frustration sometimes about stuff being said in the newspapers that we either hadn't agreed upon or hadn't said.
And how did that, realising what was happening from newspaper reports, impact on your ability to deliver important public health messages and to coordinate the pandemic response in London?
Well, by and large, I think the First Ministers, the Metro Mayors work really close together with government. We can be trusted allies. And this is the frustrating thing. If the government, under different prime ministers, can trust me in issues to do with terrorism, counter-terrorism, and other issues, you think they'd be able to trust us when it comes to issues to do with a civil emergency, a crisis, like the pandemic. I think there was bad faith on the part of some members of the government without being party political, and they projected that on us, whether it's First Ministers or mayors, which I think is unfair.
Perhaps we can look at a little bit more closely at one example of something that you learned from a newspaper report, and it's in the summer of 2020. When you learned of a government exercise to deal with what may be a major resurgence in cases within London, and the suggestion that the M25 would be used as a quarantine ring. There we are, thank you. The date of this letter is the 3rd of August 2020, which, as it happens, is a Monday. And you say, "Dear Prime Minister, it is with great surprise that we read in the Sunday papers that the government held a critical exercise last week in which a major resurgence in COVID-19 infections in London was a central scenario. According to media reports, the plans included using the M25 as a quarantine ring." You go on that your surprise is that such far-reaching contingency plans have been discussed and tested without the involvement or awareness of London's government, and this is clearly totally unacceptable and an affront to London and Londoners. Can we scroll down the page, please? You observe just in the second paragraph from the bottom of the screen, it is 12 weeks since you as Mayor were last invited to Cobra on behalf of London and its 9 million citizens, and the decisions continue to be taken without consultation with those who run and understand the country's biggest city. And can we go, please, to the next page to see, I hope, that this is a letter that is co-signed by you, if we can just scroll down, but also by Councillor Peter John, OBE, who is the Chair of London Councils, of which you've told us there were 32, or there are 32, is that right? Now, you learned about this in a newspaper on presumably Sunday the 12th, or the 2nd of August 2020, is that right?
That's right. Can I just explain? It goes back to your previous question about being the voice of London, which is these are 32 boroughs of 3 different political parties, plus the City of London Corporation, which is apolitical. One of my jobs is to hold us all together. Some are outer London, some are in London, some are central London. And you do that by engendering confidence because we're a trusted ally of the government. And it makes working relationships really difficult when we're discovering stuff as trusted allies in newspapers.
Well, this was a little bit more than even just stuff. This was a plan to deal with a major resurgence in London without incorporating your view, or indeed those of the 32 London councils. In practical terms, what was the impact of your exclusion from contingency planning such as this? Well,
in my view, us not being trusted meant that we couldn't give the advice from the coalface that may have made a difference. We now know that the entire country went into lockdown in November. I think that could have been averted. had we been involved earlier. But more important than that, I think lives may not have been lost. It upsets me when I think that more than 20,000 Londoners lost their lives because of this pandemic. It breaks my heart 105 transport workers lost their lives because of this pandemic. I genuinely think fewer lives may have been lost had there been a more collegiate response from the government. Poor process, poor judgment, poor decision making.
It may well be that answers my final question, because it wasn't until the 1st of October, some 2 months later, that you received a response to this letter. A response came from Mr. Hancock, in which he acknowledged that effective local management of any outbreak was critical. Did you, having received that response on the 1st of October, and of course we know that's before the second lockdown, did you consider that the response adequately engaged with or addressed the concerns that you had raised?
No, I think if I answer by saying this, that the last Cobra, the directly elected mayor of London attended was in May. I think that says it all.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. Mr Thomas.
Good afternoon, Mayor Khan. Just so you know who I am, I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. I've got 2 questions for you. My first is this. Mayor Khan, recognising the challenges that posed by the evolving nature of this pandemic, FEMHO is keen to understand the timeline of responses, okay? But they acknowledge the complexity of the situation, the circumstances. So let me put my first question to you. Firstly, in your evidence, in your statement, you refer to a thematic lack of communication between yourself and government during the essential early stages, and you state that you have no doubt that lives were lost as a result. So question, what impact do you think this had in the context of Black, Asian, minority ethnic health inequalities, and what could have been done differently from your end in the context of Black, Asian, minority ethnic health inequalities? Had there been clearer and earlier communications?
Well, firstly, because we still don't record ethnicity on death certificates, and I would argue we're not fully seized of the impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic people across the country. Directly in relation to health workers, I heard stories about Londoners who are Filipinos who thought they had to work in the wards without PPE because their visa may be taken away if they didn't do so. These are Londoners, by the way, who happen to be Filipinos on work permits. Query, is that probably recorded when it comes to death certificate and other metrics as well? In relation to Transport for London, for which I am responsible, I asked UCL to do some work straight away in March, April about the impact on our workers, and they reached a number of conclusions which we acted upon. Our buses were made much more safe because we were cognizant of the impact on our workers, particularly because a big proportion of our transport workers are Black, Asian, minority ethnic. By the way, so are social care workers, so are health workers. So a perspex screen, people using the middle door rather than the front door, ventilation on our buses and so forth. That's what I had responsibility for. I can't answer for social care, healthcare, retail, where others had responsibility. I do know this, though. I was reminded over the weekend in preparation for today, Mr O'Connor referred to my meeting with Boris Johnson in between the 16th of March and the 20th of March. And the minutes of that meeting show I referred to ZHZ, 0 hours contract, gig economy. Both those have higher than normal representation from Black, Asian, minority ethnics. An example of indirectly not seeing the consequences of a lack of financial support for those people. If you can only put food on the table and a roof over your head by working, by going to work, what are you going to choose to do? No financial support given to you because no support for 0 hours contract, no support for the gig economy. Those self-employed, by the way, for the first few months only got statutory sick pay. disproportionately, those people tend to be black, Asian, minority ethnics.
Let me move on to my final question. And again, I just want to put this in context. Given your prior knowledge in relation to the health inequalities, including your statutory responsibility to publish a health inequality strategy, the fact you say in your statement that you were aware of and drawn attention to negative health outcomes because of the pandemic, as well as increasing information that was coming through at the early stages of the pandemic, such as by late January, there was concern about the virus building and a considerable amount of work being done at looking at the emergency risk. We can also agree that in your statement you say between February and March 2020, members of your team were meeting the London Resilience Forum and Public Health England representatives almost on a daily basis. By the 2nd of March 2020, the Strategic Coordination Group was established, we know that, and by the 11th of March 2020, you were told by the Chief Medical Officer that there was going to be a global pandemic. The first proactive step you took in addressing the issue of minority Asian health inequalities was in May. I think that was the 7th of May, right? My question is, difficult situation, there's not good communication between the government and your office. Can you just help? Because my members would like to know what more could and should have been done.
Well, first, to complete the picture, it's worth just stating what did happen to complete the picture in advance of that. So in advance of the meeting with Chris Whitty, we'd organised for enhanced cleaning on public transport, important for commuters, but also workers as well. As I said, disproportionate number of black, Asian, minority, ethnic. In advance of me going to the first Cobra, we counselled St Patrick's Day. Big Londoners, big London community of Irish descent. And as we go to St Patrick's Day as well, really important. One of the things I raised with the Prime Minister when I met him in between first Cobra and second Cobra that I went to was the importance of financial support. In fact, after my first Cobra on the 16th of March, I wrote to the Prime Minister suggesting certain things he could do which would address the issue at the core of what you're saying, and that's financial support. And I'm not sure if the decision makers understood the indirect impact of lack of financial support, of a city like London, which is 40% black, Asian, minority, ethnic, how we get around, issues around housing. I'm not sure if the government understood. If you catch the virus because you've got to work in a shop, that's bad enough. But you'll go home, you're healthy and fit, you'll go home, give it to mum, dad who live with you, and child who may have asthma. I'm not sure if the government understood that early doors. Issues around overcrowding, they didn't really understood. Issues around, actually, you may not be articulate to advocate for PPE as somebody who's working class, black, who's a porter, somebody who's a Filipino nurse working in the NHS, a bus driver. And so it's really, really challenging. I'm not sure the government got that. We worked really closely, though, to reassure you with our trade unions, who were fantastic, from Unite doing bus drivers, RMT, ASLEF, TSA on the underground, and others that I was responsible for. Other trade unions were being proactive in relation to their members, hospitals, social care. It's been pointed out by Mr O'Connor, me lobbying for personal protective equipment. That was the lobbying coming from council leaders as well. And it goes back to the point that Mr O'Connor and I began with, which is, look, as imperfect as it is, the advantage of Cobra is those experiences people have around the table who are politicians, which adds to the conclusion the Prime Minister makes when it comes to making decisions. I saw the value added in Grenfell. I saw the value added as Mayor of London with the terror attacks in 2017. I saw the value added as Mayor of London when it came to making sure Her Majesty's funeral was successful. I wasn't there. I was absent in February and half of March. One of the things I reflect upon is the difference we could have made had we been trusted earlier to be part of that process.
Well, it comes to this, does it not? More lives could have been saved, surely.
That was the conclusion of the UCL report when it came to our bus drivers, and it upsets me as the chair of TfL. It upsets me bearing in mind who my dad was. That the conclusion of UCL was that actually, had we gone into lockdown sooner, there would have been less social transmission, less community transmission. Had we brought in the changes we brought in our bus garages, in our depots, in our buses, in our tube stations, few people would have lost their lives. Had we brought in the lockdown sooner, there could have been social distancing, less transmission of the disease. Had face coverings been brought in sooner, those with the illness, asymptomatic, may not have been passing it on. Without a doubt, the premise of your question is right. Had action been taken sooner, less lives have been lost.
And forgive me for putting this on behalf of those who I represent, it would have been less impact on healthcare and hospitals.
But also our economy. So this point about the impact on our economy, there seemed to be a lack of understanding about the inextricable link between lives and livelihoods.
I think you've made that point with respect, Mr. Khan.
Milady, that's all I ask. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Mr. Khan.
Thank you.
You're now free to go. Thank you.
Lady, we're going to move straight to our next witness, which is Mr.
I'll do the proper one.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If you'd like to repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Sorry if we've kept you waiting, Mr. Burnham.
No problem.
Thank you. For the record, can you give us your full name, please?
Andrew Murray Burnham.
Well, Mr. Burnham, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you for assisting the inquiry by providing your statement, which we have seen and which is before us. And you've had the opportunity to read that statement today, haven't you?
I have.
And you can confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
I can.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly turn to your professional background, if I may. You have a long political career. You were a Member of Parliament for Lee for under 16 years between 2001 and 2017, is that correct?
It is.
And you held a number of ministerial roles in government during that period, including, but not limited to, you were a Minister of State for Health in 2006 to 2007. You were Chief Secretary to the Treasury from 2007 to 2008. And you held two cabinet roles between 2008 and 2010. First as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and then perhaps more relevant for our purposes, you were Secretary of State for Health from the 5th of June 2009 to 11th of May 2010. We'll come back to it in due course, but it's relevant because during that time you were Secretary of State during the swine flu pandemic.
I walked into the Department of Health in early June 2009, and 3 days later a global pandemic was declared. And I've always said to the former Secretary of State, Alan Johnson, who was walked out of the door in the other direction, that he was a master of political timing always, and I think that demonstrates it.
Well, let's see if we can master timings today in relation to your evidence. And we will touch upon, perhaps after lunch and adjournment, the position and your observations between the pandemic, swine flu, and more recently in relation to the COVID pandemic. After you left government, because your party was out of government, you held a number of positions in opposition as a shadow Secretary of State in relation to education, health, and in fact you were shadow Home Secretary as well.
I was.
And it's, of course, a matter of public record. You were elected as Mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017.
Yes.
And you're currently in your second term of that
Yes.
position. I want to briefly just set out how the Mayor of Greater Manchester fits in terms of structure-wise, and perhaps try and do it simply if I can. Is this a fair summary? Is that there is the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, that's the upper tier of local government, where there's sitting above but alongside the 10 metropolitan borough councils within Greater Manchester.
Yes, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, or the GMCA, is the 10 councils. Unlike the GLA, which is a separate body above local government,
yes,
the 10 councils come together to create the GMCA. So we very much sit alongside them. I'm one of 11, you could say, but maybe the captain of that 11.
And it covers a population of Greater Manchester, which is 2.8 million approximately.
Yes.
And as in you chair the GMC as you describe, and your role is to steer the work of the authority leading on issues such as the economy, transport in particular, and police and fire services.
Yeah, I am the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester.
And you don't have, or the Mayor does not have, a public health function?
Not directly, no. Although we have a very extensive devolution agreement, and the things that I am responsible for, like housing and other things, do impact directly on health and public health.
Yes. When one compares your role as Mayor of Greater Manchester and the authority with the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority, which we just heard about, there is a difference, isn't there?
There is.
A difference in, if perhaps just to assist you, a difference in relation to Civil Contingency Act.
Yes. The GLA and the Mayor, I understand, are designated as a Category 1 responder in the Civil Contingencies Act. That's not the case for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, or indeed any of the other combined authorities across England.
I'm pausing there. A Category 1 responder is someone who has a duty under the Civil Contingency Act to plan, prepare, train and respond to an emergency.
Yes. We played that role in the COVID pandemic at a Greater Manchester level. So I convened a COVID emergency committee to sit above, if you like, the local resilience forum, so that we were working in a highly joined up way across the whole of our city region. But formally, we do not have that designation in the Civil Contingencies Act, and it would be helpful if we did.
And that's something which we will return to at the end in terms of the lessons learned or things to improve going forward. You touched upon the the local resilience forum, or fora. That's a forum in a region or an area where a number of Category 1 responders come together to respond to emergency or plan for emergency.
Yes, and the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum played a huge role in steering us through our response to COVID.
Yes. Let's move on to the next topic, which is the early days and awareness of COVID leading up to the first lockdown. And in relation to that, I can perhaps summarise your evidence, if I may, and you can tell me if I'm on the right or wrong track. You say in your statement that you first became aware of COVID through media reports, and your first real engagement was through the local Chinese community in Manchester. And there is a strong Chinese community in Manchester, is that correct?
That is correct. Manchester as a city had a long-standing twinning arrangement with Wuhan. So some of the familial connections that our Chinese community had were with that area. So I attended 2 community meetings in January, and I think one going into early February, when the community was in a very high state of alarm and was asking for my help to get PPE through Manchester Airport, donations sent over. So I really became very aware of just how serious the situation was in China in that period of time.
Yes. And it was an outward-looking view, it was concern for those people in China through that Wuhan lens. You did mention in your statement, again summarising if I may, that there was a first roundtable meeting on the 18th of February regarding COVID in Manchester. But it really was only until the 1st of March that the Strategic Coordination Group, the SCG, we've heard about those already this morning, was set up by the Resilience Forum, the local Resilience Forum.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that was in response to the first COVID case in Greater Manchester.
Yes.
And thereafter, you describe that it was really only around the 13th of March that your perception of the seriousness of the threat of COVID changed. Was that the position?
Well, it was changing all the way through that period. As I said earlier, as someone who had experienced a pandemic in 2009 as Secretary of State, I obviously had an understanding of how the situation might develop. So I was watching it carefully. I was following statements from the World Health Organization. So I could see the picture changing, and so our understanding was building. And Greater Manchester, in that period, was starting to develop the arrangements that we would need, or we felt we needed. The degree of coordination that we would need to pull together was building.
In relation to that, if I may, just to assist, is in sort of setting up those arrangements. You mentioned that it was around the 18th of March that you, together with the leader of the local councils, established the Greater Manchester COVID-19 Committee.
Yeah.
On the 18th. You mentioned that a few moments ago.
Yeah.
On the 20th of March, the SCG declared a major incident.
Yes.
The position really was that it was in March where Manchester started to really move into a response phase. Is that correct?
I think that would be fair. I mean, clearly we'd taken some steps in February to coordinate, and we were building our response. But you're right, the response phase began more formally in March. And obviously the establishment of a COVID emergency committee, which was myself, the 10 leaders, the 10 directors of public health, senior players in the Greater Manchester system, the chief constable, chief fire officer. You know, that wasn't something that we were required to do, but as a mature administration across the city region, it's something we decided to do ourselves to make sure we were as highly coordinated as we could be. So,
could I just ask a question in relation to that?
Yeah.
So we described how Manchester was responding and putting in those structures in March. Was that something which was brought about regionally, self-created, or was that something under direction from central government?
No, there are some things, obviously, that are required in statute, but the Greater Manchester COVID Emergency Committee was a voluntary initiative on our part to make sure, as I said, that the political leadership of the city region was very much knitted into the administrative leadership of the city region. And as I said, that we were as connected and as joined up as possible.
Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think Manchester perhaps should have done more and done more earlier?
It's hard to say because we weren't getting any guidance from a national level. It wasn't been made clear to us, you know, what we should be doing. So we were, as I say, we were putting together the picture ourselves and beginning to develop the structures that we thought we were going to need to get us through what lay ahead. So it's always with hindsight, you would say, well, it would have been better had we done it earlier. But actually, we had started to pull together these collaborative arrangements in February. We had a meeting, for instance, with all of our big voluntary sector partners in that month as well. So, you know, always you might say, well, in an ideal world, it could have been sooner. But in the absence of very clear instructions from central government, I think, you know, we were quite unique, actually, in establishing our own full committee that, as I say, united political leadership with more administrative leadership in the city region.
And was the seriousness of the pandemic in late February and early March clear to you as the Mayor of Manchester, Greater Manchester?
It was clear, and in that period, as is referenced in my statement, I started to make more public comment on pandemic policy nationally. Having been Secretary of State in a global pandemic, I felt I had something to contribute that was meant to be helpful. I remember the day when I saw an article from a health minister appear behind a paywall. And I just thought to myself, this isn't right. We're not getting this right. You know, people need information at this moment in time. You can't have articles behind paywalls. And I kind of went public that day with a long thread of tweets, kind of being honest about my experience as Secretary of State in the swine flu pandemic. And we made many mistakes on communications. It's hard communicating in a pandemic. And I tried to share that honestly and openly. And I called actually for a daily briefing. I said that there should be, and I said there should be a briefing that's not led by politicians, because a mistake I had made in swine flu was giving out information which always then was seen politically, and then it goes into the fray and all the rest of it. At that time, we agreed that the Chief Medical Officer of the time, Professor Sir Liam Donaldson, would lead our briefings without politicians present, and I advocated that would have been a better approach.
So your view would be a scientist alone giving a scientific briefing and politicians giving a briefing separately?
I think so, and I think some of what's come out through this inquiry is how sometimes those different views were there and they weren't clear to the public because people wouldn't be invited to the press briefing at number 10. I mean, it needs to be better than that. If there's a disagreement between the scientists and the experts and the ministers, I think people need to know that, and therefore that separation is helpful. I'm not saying that every briefing should be done in that way, and it would be appropriate for the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet to stand with experts from time to time, but every day, the problem with that is it just makes communications too political.
Thank you. And that's your reflection from your time as Secretary of State?
Yes, it is.
I've got two questions on that, Mr Burnham. Firstly, don't you then have a problem potentially of inconsistent messaging?
Well, hopefully not, Chair. So you would try, as a government, not to allow that. You would hope, would you not, that ministers would be following the advice. I think the experts' briefings should relate more to the epidemiological information, the profile of the virus, the advice to the public. I always felt uncomfortable saying, oh, you know, wash your hands, sneeze in this, don't do this, do that. That's not really for politicians to do. That is for, I would say, for experts to do. I think the public receive it differently from an expert than they do from a politician. And I think there is a role for people standing together, as I said, but at the same time, just giving more factual information to the public, in my view, is better done without politicians in the room.
But then you have the second risk I'm going to put to you, which is that some members of the public associate the expert with the decision-making. In other words, they attribute responsibility for the decision-making to the expert if you put them up front.
I think what I would say, Chair, is better separate the roles of different people so that the public can see those different roles. That was all merged together, I would say, in the communications through the COVID pandemic, particularly in 2020. I think if the expert said, this is our view and this is what we see in the evidence and these are the options for ministers, and then the next day the minister said, well, and now we're doing that. I think that I'm not going to sort of put a huge emphasis on this because it's hard to communicate in a pandemic, as I said, and I made mistakes as Secretary of State in that area, which I tried to share in the spirit of getting it right. But I think mistakes were also made in the COVID pandemic. There should have been the drumbeat of briefings should have been more officials and experts. But occasionally then ministers would come in together where we're now taking a decision based on the evidence you've been hearing for the last few days, and our decision is this. I just think that would have helped everybody. Certainly, as we will come to, I'm sure, over Tier 3. I don't think it was understood at the time that SAGE had given very different advice to ministers it looked like everyone was joined up.
Mr. Burnham, I think we're going to come back to that. I don't want to get too much out of order. My lady, there's one small topic which is linked to this. Perhaps I could deal with that, which is linked to communication. So, Mr. Burnham, I want to stick with communication.
Yep.
And how difficult it is. But also, in terms of chronology, we are around just before the first lockdown. And the announcement around that time from Mr. Jenrick in around the 22nd of March, or a little bit earlier, about the need for shielding and shielding those people. And in particular, I've been asked to explore with you in relation to domestic abuse, those who are at risk of domestic abuse, your concerns at that time in relation to those announcements and the impact for those who were at risk of domestic abuse.
Well, we were immediately on that issue, principally because the Right Honourable Beverly Hughes, who was my Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime at the time, was very concerned about those issues. And I think this is where you have politicians in the room with officers. Those issues perhaps get brought out more quickly. We were always conscious of the social impact of lockdowns. You know, what would be the effect of shielding of lockdowns of different forms? And we were concerned, given, sadly, the high rate of domestic abuse in parts of Greater Manchester, that could exacerbate those concerns, and who would be there to help people in situations when they were trapped in a very abusive situation.
And did you raise those concerns with central government?
We did. We discussed this issue a number of times. As I said, we always had the Chief Constable or his deputy at our COVID emergency committee, and they took very seriously what we were saying, and we did relay those concerns to central government.
Thank you. Lily, is that a convenient time?
Certainly. We will complete your evidence this afternoon, Mr. Burnham. 2:05, please.